Ethan's neighborhood was the picture of suburban peace. A charming cul-de-sac where families enjoyed barbecues, kids played hopscotch on the sidewalks, and the sound of wind chimes filled the air. It was the perfect place to settle down. At the edge of the neighborhood sat Ethan's pride and joy, a small private farm that had been in his family for generations. Surrounded by a sturdy fence, boasting a vibrant garden, a cozy barn, and a rooster weather vane spinning atop the roof, the farm was his sanctuary from the mundane chaos of city life. It was more than just a property, it was his heritage. But every paradise has its serpent. In this case, it was Karen. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, armed with an iron will, a clipboard, and an uncanny ability to find fault in the tiniest of things. To her, the neighborhood wasn't a community, it was her personal kingdom. Her reign of petty terror had left many in the neighborhood quietly grumbling, but no one dared to openly challenge her. That is until she turned her sights on Ethan and his farm. It started innocently enough, if one could ever call Karen's actions innocent. She appeared at Ethan's doorstep one sunny morning, clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield of righteousness. Her tone was polite, but her expression betrayed the storm brewing underneath. "Ethan," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "I'm sure you're aware of our HOA guidelines. Your fence looks questionable." Ethan raised an eyebrow. Questionable? He glanced over at the sturdy, well-maintained wooden fence that had stood there long before the HOA even existed. Karen nodded sharply. "Yes. It doesn't align with the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood." Suppressing a chuckle, Ethan replied, "Karen, it's a fence. It literally blends in." "Rules are rules," she said with a tight smile before handing him a neatly typed violation notice. As she walked away, Ethan shook his head, wondering how someone could take offense so personally. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. Karen's clipboard crusade had just begun, and Ethan's peaceful farm was about to become ground zero for her latest power trip. Karen's clipboard became a weapon of mass frustration as she ramped up her campaign against Ethan's farm. It seemed like every day, a new violation notice appeared in his mailbox, each more absurd than the last. One morning, Ethan found a bright pink slip accusing him of unauthorized vegetation because his sunflowers were taller than the HOA's recommended height. Another day, she cited him for the reflective hazard caused by the rooster weather vane atop his barn. Ethan couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. Karen didn't stop at notices. She took her patrols to the next level, pacing the edge of Ethan's property with the intensity of a prison warden inspecting for contraband. On one occasion, she stood on the sidewalk, hands on her hips, glaring at Ethan's barn like it had personally offended her. When Ethan caught her pointing a laser measure at his fence, presumably checking its height, he finally confronted her. "Karen, are you serious right now?" he called out, leaning over his porch railing. She turned, clipboard at the ready. "I'm ensuring compliance," she snapped, as though she were single-handedly preserving the sanctity of the neighborhood. Her antics escalated when she began enlisting other HOA members to join her cause. At a hastily arranged HOA meeting, Karen presented a slideshow titled "The Farm Problem," complete with overly dramatic photos of Ethan's property. "This fence," she declared, pointing to an image projected on the wall, "is an eyesore. It disrupts the neighborhood's harmony." Ethan couldn't help but interject. "Karen, it's a wooden fence. It's practically invisible unless you're standing in my yard." Karen shot him a withering glare. "It's the principle of the matter, Ethan. The HOA guidelines are clear, and we all have to follow them." Despite her insistence, the other members were less than enthusiastic about her crusade. A few nodded lightly, but most exchanged amused glances or subtly rolled their eyes. It was clear that Karen's war on Ethan's farm was more about her obsession with control than any real violation of the rules. But Karen wasn't deterred by the lack of support. If anything, it only fueled her determination. She began issuing warnings about potential fines for Ethan's noncompliance, and even hinted at escalating the matter to legal action. Her dramatic behavior reached its peak one afternoon when Ethan caught her standing on a step ladder outside his property, attempting to take photos over the fence. "Karen," Ethan shouted, marching toward her. "Get off my ladder," she huffed, climbing down with exaggerated dignity. "I was merely inspecting for potential violations," she said, clutching her clipboard like a badge of honor. Ethan could only shake his head. This wasn't just about a fence or a farm anymore. It was about Karen's insatiable need to wield power, no matter how ridiculous the circumstances. And Ethan was determined to push back. Ethan's patience was wearing thin. Every morning, he found new violation notices taped to his gate like unwanted decorations. Every afternoon, Karen strutted down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, surveying the neighborhood like a self-appointed queen. But he wasn't the only one suffering. Tom, his next-door neighbor, had been slapped with a warning about his non-HOA-compliant lawn chairs. Sarah, a retiree who lived 2 houses down, received a fine for feeding birds in her yard. Karen claimed it attracted undesirable wildlife. And Rachel, a single mother, had been accused of allowing her children to create unsightly sidewalk chalk art. The neighborhood was growing tired of Karen's dictatorship. One evening, Ethan decided to gather his neighbors. He hosted an informal backyard barbecue, inviting those he knew had been targeted by Karen's endless citations. Over grilled burgers and cold beer, they shared their grievances. "This isn't about rules anymore," Tom said, shaking his head. "It's about control. She's turning this place into a police state," Sarah added. "And for what? Because she doesn't like seeing people enjoy their own property." "We should do something," Rachel said. "But what?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, thinking. "We fight back," he finally said. "Not with anger, not with aggression, but by using her own game against her." And so, the resistance was born. Ethan started documenting everything. Every time Karen stepped onto his property, he recorded it. Every violation notice she left, he saved. And every unreasonable fine she issued to his neighbors, he compiled into a growing file labeled HOA Tyranny. He also did something Karen never expected. He read the HOA bylaws cover to cover. And what he found changed everything. Karen had been overstepping her authority. There were rules in place to prevent excessive fines, prevent harassment, and even limit the HOA board's ability to unilaterally enforce changes without majority approval. Armed with knowledge, Ethan and his neighbors began challenging every violation. Sarah installed a second bird feeder. Rachel's kids started drawing chalk murals bigger than ever. Tom left his lawn chairs out, adding even more colorful decorations. And Ethan? He planted more sunflowers, their towering stalks a silent middle finger to Karen's arbitrary vegetation restrictions. Karen, sensing she was losing control, called for an emergency HOA meeting. The meeting was held in the community center, a space that was usually reserved for neighborhood potlucks and holiday parties. But that night, it was a battleground. Karen sat at the head of the long table, flanked by her few remaining loyalists. The room was packed. Most of the neighborhood had shown up, eager to see how the evening would unfold. She cleared her throat and launched into a speech about community standards, how Ethan's farm was a blight upon their pristine neighborhood, and how the rising defiance against HOA rules would lead to chaos. Ethan let her talk. Then, when she finally paused, he stood up and placed a thick binder on the table with a satisfying thud. "This," he said, "is a record of every violation notice you've issued in the last 6 months." Karen's smile faltered. Ethan opened the binder. "This includes fines that exceed the legal HOA limit, warnings issued for non-existent rules, and, most importantly, documentation of you trespassing on private property, something the HOA bylaws explicitly forbid." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I've also taken the liberty of filing a formal complaint with the county HOA regulatory board," Ethan continued. "They'll be reviewing all HOA activities under your leadership." Karen turned red. "You can't." "I already did." The HOA board members exchanged nervous glances. Karen's staunchest allies suddenly seemed unsure of their footing. Ethan turned to the room. "The HOA is meant to serve the community, not terrorize it. I propose a vote to remove Karen as HOA president." Silence hung in the air. Then, one by one, hands went up. Karen sputtered. "You can't just." A senior board member, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. "The bylaws allow for a recall vote if a majority of homeowners agree." He glanced at Karen. "And it looks like the majority has spoken." Within a week, the HOA board formally removed Karen from her position. She fought back, of course. She threatened legal action, wrote angry letters, and even tried to rally support from her dwindling circle of loyalists. But the neighborhood had turned against her. The final blow came when the county HOA regulatory board confirmed that she had violated multiple bylaws. Not only was she stripped of her position, but she was also fined for misusing HOA funds for her personal vendettas. And then, just like that, she was gone. One morning, Ethan woke up to find a moving truck in front of Karen's house. By the evening, she had packed up and left, her reign of clipboard tyranny officially over. With Karen gone, the neighborhood changed. The HOA, under new leadership, repealed many of Karen's ridiculous policies. The fines stopped. The newsletters became friendly instead of passive-aggressive. And best of all, people felt free to enjoy their homes again. Ethan's farm remained intact. His sunflowers continued to grow, his barn stood tall, and the rooster weather vane spun proudly atop the roof. One afternoon, Tom knocked on his door, holding a wooden plaque. "What's this?" Ethan asked. Tom grinned. "A little something from the neighborhood." Ethan read the inscription. "Ethan, defender of the neighborhood." He laughed, shaking his head. "You guys didn't have to do this." Tom clapped him on the shoulder. "Yeah, we did." That evening, the neighbors gathered for another barbecue. This time, not to plan a rebellion, but to celebrate their newfound freedom. As Ethan watched kids chase fireflies and families laugh together, he knew one thing for certain. Some battles were worth fighting. Months later, Ethan spotted a for sale sign in Karen's old yard. A young couple moved in, eager to start fresh. They had no idea about the battle that had taken place before them, nor did they need to. The neighborhood was peaceful again. And as Ethan sat on his porch, sipping a cold beer, he smiled. The farm was safe. The community was whole. And Karen was nothing more than a cautionary tale.